Hey there, writers and readers. This is Jared, host of the MFA Writers Pod, just popping in to say Happy New Year. Although 2020 was a weird year for us, and I'm sure a lot of you, this podcast has really brought a lot of joy to me and to my partner, Hannah. So we just wanted to say thank you so much to all of you for listening. Thank you so much for engaging with us on social media. You can find us on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. We love hearing from you, and we really love reading your reviews. There have been days this year that have been really hard when we've found one of your reviews and it's just brightened our day. Like this one from Blah Chat, who wrote, "The MFA Writers Podcast is simply the best. Each guest has a unique background, and the host, Jared, does a great job of asking the right questions and highlighting the work and experiences of the guests. Informative, enlightening, and entertaining. Check out this pod." Thank you so much to Blah Chat for writing that. And after listening to this episode, if you have time to leave your own review on Apple Podcasts or another podcasting platform, we'd really appreciate it. Like I said, it really brightens our day, it helps us improve, and it helps other people find the podcast, which helps us grow. And of course, after listening to the episode, if you go to mfawriters.com, you can find links to the various things we mention in the episode, including the fantastic work of these emerging writers. So thanks again, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Emily Holland, a lesbian writer with poems appearing in publications including Nat Brut, Homology Lit, Bedfellows, and Wussy. She is the author of the 2019 chapbook Lineage from Dancing Girl Press. Her work has received support from the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities and Sundress Academy for the Arts. Currently, she is the editor of Poet Lore and the editor-in-chief of Folio at American University, where she is a second-year MFA student in poetry. Today, Emily is going to read two of her poems for us.
Poem in which everything is ASMR. Unzip is another word for open, as in I unzip my eyes when mascara sticks them together and I decide I'm not wearing makeup anymore. I like the sound of carbonation popping with the snap of the can's tab, so I open one, and then another, and then another. I build myself a fortress with fizzing cans of cheap beers, take a foamy sip out of each one before adding it to the stack. The girl I love comes home and doesn't know how to navigate around me in my can castle. I invite her to drink her way in. I can't drink them all myself without risking buoyancy. Like in that movie when the drink lifts the boy and his grandpa higher and higher, and all of us watching are left wondering when. Elopement. The desert has its own quiet desire, spliced with cracks and canyons, punctuated by the slowest growth. We go in January and see snow. Even the melt, a delayed departure. We drive until the road turns to dust, pass a white piano, count 8 sleeping palms, arrive where backyard Joshua trees formed an altar for an elopement the previous week. On the nightstand of the B&B, a dried corsage, leftover wine in the fridge. We get high and talk about marriage again. No plans for engagement. Maybe we should skip the charade, elope too. It must have been beautiful. Moonlight on iced over snow, stars flickering their own fireless chorus. No objections from tumbleweeds, just the high desert mountains and their lilac blessing on the horizon.
Emily, thanks for reading those beautiful poems and thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So let's start with the first one, poem in which everything is ASMR. It is a beautiful piece and has a, like when I was reading it, I was thinking like this kind of light and airy intimacy to it. not only in subject matter, but also in like the language and the structure of the poem. So first, for anyone who doesn't know what ASMR is, I was hoping you could explain it and tell us what made you want to write a poem about it.
Yeah. So ASMR is, there's like a big scientific word that I didn't look up before doing this, but I should have. But it has to deal with the kind of like tactile nature of the sound. So in those popular YouTube videos, there's people kind of opening something that's really crinkly and drinking soda, and the microphone picks up all of those kind of ambient noises. And they became really popular on the internet for a while, with a lot of people just, cutting bars of soap and cutting chocolate and like all these like really almost sounds that you ignore in your everyday life just becoming amplified and kind of filling the space in the headphones when you're watching. And I guess you could say I became kind of obsessed with those videos not to a scary degree, but, I was, it was so fascinating to see, what are they going to eat next? What are they going to open next or cut next? And so I started thinking about, the ways that poetry is also so obsessed with these sounds and how the sounds kind of build the world of the poem as well. And it just felt like something that would translate well to using these kind of really active sounds in a poem, which was something that I wanted to do.
That's really cool. And my understanding of ASMR is there's also like, for some people, like a physical kind of reaction to these sounds. So I think it's really cool, the idea of incorporating that into a poem, in the sense like the idea of reading a poem and the sounds of the poem eliciting even a physical reaction in someone is kind of a beautiful idea, right?
Yeah. And there's a way that a lot of those sounds, the people, when you watch those videos, you're looking to get some kind of pleasure from it. You're not going to watch it if you think it's gross. So I think that played a lot into thinking about the content of the poem and maybe thinking about how the sounds and the tactile nature of those sounds in the poem could translate to this sort of searching for pleasure in the speaker there.
Well, you write a lot about desire in your poems, and in this poem, there's a certain building of feeling and expectation. And then as you wrote, the girl I love comes home and the narrator invites her to drink her way in. The reader, I think, feels that desire as much in these words as in what's left unsaid. So what is it about desire that fuels your poetry, you think?
Yeah, I guess it comes back to this idea of obsession, right? And like, what can I always count on is going to somehow show up? And for me, that tracing kind of the trajectory of my work, it has been this idea of desire, whether that's between two characters in a poem, whether it's the speaker's relationship to a place, this kind of yearning, or even desire in different emotions, like grief as a form of desire, for instance, desiring for someone to be still with us. And so I think that there's a way that the theme seems to never be touchable. Like everything that you're writing kind of gets close to it in a way. Or kind of dances around it, and maybe we get closer to this kind of concrete idea, but that it's never going to be able to be fully put into words, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. I'm just thinking about my own writing with fiction. People talk about how important it is to know the characters' wants and needs and fears and all that stuff. So the desire of the character is really important, but it's kind of cool to think about it in this sense, like as a feeling that you're trying to like impart and give to the reader. And just the idea of that, like the sounds of the poem could somehow elicit that. It's pretty cool. And And I mentioned the structure of this poem is unique. I definitely encourage all listeners to go to homologylit.com and give it a look. You can also find the link on mfawriters.com. But could you maybe describe the structure of this poem and talk a bit about using the structure to accentuate themes in this poem or just in your poetry in general?
Yeah. So this poem visually is, I guess there's a lot of white space on the page. And I think initially I was thinking about the ways that the words could interact in that sense sonically. So kind of pairing certain groups of words together to form one unit of sound, but not necessarily in a linear way. But then also thinking about the poem's kind of concerns with this sort of fizziness and this carbonation, bubbliness. I thought that it kind of matched the content too, in the way that the words almost could be like bubbles or something kind of floating on the page, not in a fixed way. But I don't always think about form relating to content in that visual space. But it's nice when you can kind of play with that. I think for the second poem I read, Elopement, that one's currently in couplets. And it might change because I think I rely on couplets a lot. But for me, with that poem, couplets feels right because it's about this sort of coupling relationship. And so I think that feels natural in a poem like that.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm wondering now, like, you said that you don't always think about form with your poetry, but when you do, is it often something that you realize during the process of writing it, or after you've finished writing it, you realize that maybe there's a better form? How does that usually work for you?
It's normally an after the fact. I typically find myself drafting in couplets. I'm not sure what that says about me as a person. It probably says something about my personality, but I think, maybe my brain just works better in thinking of lines as groups of two. And somehow all my drafts kind of circle this sonnet length, almost 14 lines. But they don't always stay like that. So I think it's rare for me to set out to write a poem and it stay that shape in the whole drafting process. I think it might return to its original shape by the end, but I always try to at least break it open and crack it out of that initial impulse to see what other possibilities there are in the poem.
Yeah, cool. Well, I totally got that idea of, like, in the first poem, that like kind of light and airy, bubbly nature to it. The structure really accentuated that for me. So definitely, listeners, go and read that poem, take a look at it. And then desire appears again in the first line of Elopement, a beautiful line. The desert has its own quiet desire, spliced with cracks and canyons, punctuated by the slowest growth. I really love that opening. And like many of your poems, this one explores queerness and is set in the South. How important is place to your work?
Yeah, place is really important. I think the more I develop as a writer, place feels like not just a way to ground characters in the poem or the narrative of the poem, but also to kind of tease out some of those themes. So with Elopement, thinking about this landscape that's vast and open and kind of untamable, that was a way to kind of crack into the idea of this relationship that maybe is kind of on a precipice, right? Like not really knowing, should there be a marriage? Should we talk about this? That kind of questioning between the speaker and the other in the poem. But then having grown up in the South, particularly in North Carolina, I find myself returning to those kind of spaces in my poems as well, as a way to tease out a little bit of the kind of queerness that I might have shut down in myself growing up in that space. So for example, the other poem at Homology Lit is about a cookout, which is a great fast food place if you don't know. But it's kind of, it was kind of a joke writing the poem at first, like, oh, I'm going to write about cookout and, the menu combinations and all of these things. And then it became a way to sort of ground this group of friends on the eve of maybe their last summer or maybe their last summer together, kind of on the cusp of a transition in life, but rooted in this very heavily kind of populated space of the fast food chain. So I think using place in my poems is a way to reconfigure what that place maybe meant to me, and then how it can mean different things to different speakers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that kind of, because when you're a kid, there's nothing else. Like it's just what there is, the place that you're growing up in, right? You don't really have much of a choice in it, and you just accept it. But then to return to that as an adult, as a writer, and explore that in your writing, I just think it's a really deep well of inspiration. At least it is for me. It sounds like it is for you as well. So like you said, both of these poems touch on the queer experience, but I found this one particularly moving when the characters get high and talk about marriage again, imagining no objections from tumbleweeds, just the high desert mountains and their lilac blessing on the horizon. Just that idea of like potential objections made me rethink the entire poem and just consider the queer marriage experience. So I'm curious, how autobiographical do your poems tend to be? And why is writing about the queer experience so important to you?
Yeah, I think as far as biographical, autobiographical, they tend to be pretty autobiographical, but I never conflate myself with the speakers in my poems, because I'm always thinking about how even in a memory, when we're thinking back on things, we're telling ourselves another story, another version of how it was. And I think that enables me to get some distance from what maybe I'm trying to translate onto the page, but also get some distance between myself and the speaker, even if the speaker maybe is a version of myself at a different time. And so, yeah, I do tend to really pull from my own experiences. And I think that's important for me when I'm writing about queerness, because everyone's experience is different. And I think that I really try to stay in my own sort of experience and my own understandings and my own grapplings with what it means to be queer, what it means to be queer from the South, what it means to be queer and not know what marriage means with queerness. I think kind of grappling with these personal questions is important for me to just kind of embody my experience, but also give myself a little bit of freedom on the page to separate myself.
And you told me that your time in the program has helped you grow as an artist and helped you push those themes, desire, queerness, the South, in different ways. Could you talk about that a little bit? Like how has the program helped you to develop in those ways?
Yeah, I think, coming into the MFA program, I had a creative writing background in undergrad, and I took a few years off between undergrad and graduate school. And for most of my undergraduate career, I was not in a space personally to really identify as queer. And so my poems didn't really inhabit any of that kind of space. I still wrote about kind of the same things. I wrote about the South. I wrote about growing up, and I wrote about my family, but I wasn't really doing the kind of interrogation of what those things meant, because I still hadn't figured out who I was as a person. And so I think in those early poems, that I try not to look at anymore, but I think in those versions, it was a lot of me kind of dancing around the idea of the artist I wanted to be, and then coming into the MFA program and feeling firmly grounded in who I was as an individual and as a queer person and a member of the writing community here in DC. I think it allowed me to kind of clear away some of the surface level things and really dig deep into the themes that otherwise I wouldn't have really cross-pollinated across my work. And also a lot of that too comes with reading more. And I think in the program, both in classes and then just on recommendations from professors and things like that, I was able to take in a lot more work and kind of broaden my reading experience too.
Well, you mentioned taking off a few years between your undergrad time at George Washington University before you started the MFA. What were you doing during that time?
I was managing a coffee shop. So, I thought, like any English major in undergrad, I was like, ooh, I should work at a coffee shop. That's what you do. Coffee shop or bookstore, those were like my two options. So I got a job as a barista in undergrad, and then didn't really know what to do and just kind of stuck with it, and worked my way up to top of the food chain at the coffee bar level. And I told myself, this is something I'll do while I love it. And once I stop loving it, I need to do something else. And I knew I always wanted to go back to graduate school and focus on my writing. But after undergrad, I was really burnt out. And so I didn't read or write really for like a year and a half after I graduated. It was like coffee, and that was it. But then I started to get kind of the itch to go back and the itch to go back to my own work. So I started looking for opportunities, ways to get back into the community, different open mic nights and things in the area. I took some online workshops. I did a workshop with the Juniper Summer Writing Institute up at UMass, which was amazing. Writer camp with Barrel House magazine, which was also great. Just sort of different things to kind of crack into my creative world again before taking the leap into an MFA program.
And then you also told me that you made a deliberate choice to pursue the MFA. What did you mean by that?
I think when I graduated from my undergraduate career, it sort of seemed like, okay, you have this degree in creative writing in English. The natural step is to do an MFA. And I sort of resisted that at that time. Maybe I just didn't want to do another application or something. But I think, taking the time off, and then coming back and doing these various workshop things and knowing that there were spaces that I could pretty much get a similar experience to an MFA, but not through an MFA program. I really had to sit down and kind of talk with myself, talk through the motivations of getting this degree. Why do I want to be there? Why do I want to apply and potentially pay for another degree? Really kind of like sit with myself and make that decision, and talk through the benefits and what I wanted from a program, before just thinking that it was the natural next step. Right.
Well, you were already working at Poet Lore at that point. Is that right?
Yeah, I was.
So how did you get that job? And, maybe you could just tell us about that experience because you're still working there, right?
Yeah. I'm still at Poet Lore, which is the nation's oldest poetry magazine. And we're still in print. We do 2 print issues a year. And in part of my falling out of love with the coffee shop job, I was looking for different things to do to get back into some form of literary community here. So I did what anyone does, and I went on Google and I just said, literary magazine internships, Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And Poet Lore came up, and prior to that search, I hadn't really known about Poet Lore. And I had been living in the DC area for about almost 6 years at that time. But I started as an intern and, doing various kind of admin tasks, working in our archives, reading submissions, things like that. And then the staff was going through a transition, and I knew at that point that I had decided to go to graduate school. I had been accepted at that point. So I knew that I would have some flexibility with my schedule. And so I applied for the managing editor position, and it worked out because I was already involved with the workflow and the production and things like that. So I've been there ever since, about 2 years now.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's the kind of position that a lot of MFA students probably think that they would like to get an MFA in order to get a position like that. So was there a part of you that thought like, oh, now that I have this position, I don't need to get the MFA?
Yeah, that was part of it, part of my questioning, like, okay, if things like literary magazine jobs with either at like the independent level or were published by a nonprofit in the Bethesda area called the Writer Center, if those jobs are what you would typically want with your MFA, I really had to ask myself, like, why do I want this degree? And I think for me, it came down to, I love school. I wasn't always the best student in undergrad, but I think there is part of me that was ready to jump at the chance to be able to learn more, learn from people who I wouldn't necessarily have access to otherwise, be in kind of a writing community again, and have the freedom to take courses, not just focused on creative writing, but film courses, literature courses, things like that I could really broaden my reach a little bit.
Well, let's talk about the program a bit. American University is home to the only MFA in creative writing program in Washington, D.C. According to the website, students are free to pursue a single genre or explore several over the course of 2 years of study that integrates writing, literary journalism, translation, and the study of literature to prepare students for a range of career possibilities. So have you done much cross-genre work since you've been in the program?
I have not done much cross-genre work with workshops. Mostly that's because I'm a relatively slow writer when it comes to like churning out work. And so I knew if I took, for instance, like a creative nonfiction workshop, I was like, well, then how do I fill my thesis with poems if I'm not working on the poems? Right. So I've stayed my workshops at least focused in poetry, but I've taken other courses, a literary journalism course, for instance, a course in translation and adaptation, things that allow me to pull from different areas of study and expand in that way.
So is the program pretty flexible then in allowing you to kind of take some of these courses that wouldn't be typical in an MFA track?
Yeah. It's super flexible. And I think that's a huge draw of the program is that you don't have to come in knowing exactly what your genre is. And it also helps build a little bit of that community, because you'll have a poetry class with fiction students and nonfiction students, or you'll be in a fiction class with the poetry student. There's no boundaries to the workshop. So you get to experience everyone's work in different ways and in different places. So you kind of see how everyone works in different genres throughout.
And then what about like literature courses? Have you been able to take literature courses that intersect with your own work?
Yeah, I think that is one of the biggest, well, at least that was one of my main concerns was, when you choose to go back for another degree, you want to be able to take things that interest you, or that at least kind of build on your areas of interest. So I took a course on feminism and fiction, and, I'm a poet, but I'm interested in feminism and feminist literature. So that course was pretty transformative when it comes to that. And, even I took a film course about film and the human body. And so thinking about the way the body on film is different, or maybe the same as to how I write the body in my poems and things like that. There's always been at least one thing that I can translate from a more literature studies course to my creative work. And a lot of times professors, knowing that there's MFA students in their courses, will offer creative opportunities throughout the course as well, where you can choose to do a research paper, or you could choose to do a creative project or something like that.
Well, you had a pretty diverse background before coming into the MFA program. You told me you took undergraduate classes in journalism and queer studies, film studies, and translation. So has it been fun to return to some of those subjects as an MFA student?
Yeah, it's been great. In undergraduate courses, I think it was just kind of getting the tip of the iceberg, almost like there's all these options, and I'm going to try to find what I like to do. And now it's almost like returning to the buffet, but you're only getting the things that you really liked from the first time through. And so, yeah, I think it's been rewarding to be able to revisit, especially, thinking of translation and journalism, film studies, just these areas that have some cross-pollination with other opportunities in different like writing venues, like writing reviews, writing film critique, or long form pieces of journalism, creative nonfiction, things like that. So yeah, it's been great.
It sounds really fun. I would definitely recommend anyone who's applying to MFA programs, thinking about where to apply, to look at the courses that you'll be taking outside of workshop, because it really varies from program to program. And I think programs like yours, where you have a lot of flexibility to just go in whatever direction interests you, can be really rewarding. So that's great. American also seems to focus on preparing students for a writing career, which I don't think enough MFA programs do. Do you feel like they do a good job of preparing you for whatever comes next after the MFA?
Yeah, I think, when we talk about the academic climate and the job market and things like that, it can get very bleak and dismal, and it can feel like, why am I doing this if there's no jobs? And I think that what American does really well is most, if not all, of the professors, at least that I've had, have experience at obviously the college level teaching, but they're also involved in various things, whether it's community-based workshops, publishing houses, or things where they have connections for internships, journalism, reviews, different venues to focus on writing, but maybe venues that pay for writing. And so I think there's an openness to the community where it's not, I've never had a professor that's kind of shied away from being honest about job prospects, but also, giving different possibilities for opportunities that aren't necessarily the academic teaching path, kind of opening up the world. There's a lot you can do with a writing degree if you kind of open your mind to the possibilities outside of teaching with it. And so we do have teaching courses. You can take the teaching practicum and then teach your second year, but you don't have to do that. And there's kind of an openness to figuring out, different ways to build a career as a writer that don't completely revolve around fighting for a teaching job.
Right. Well, I think it's really good that the professors there are having those conversations because I think they're important ones. And the post-MFA career panic is real. It hits you at the strangest times, but it's real. What are like a couple of takeaways maybe that you've had from those conversations, just for any listeners who don't get to have those conversations?
I think the main one is to be creative, especially now with most things going virtual. There's a lot of opportunities at the kind of community workshop-based level. Different nonprofits that do workshops that are, maybe putting out calls for workshop proposals. And maybe that's a way to get that teaching experience. But also thinking about, if you want to be part of the literary community, getting involved maybe in a literary nonprofit or a reading series at the local level or something like that. Just different ways to kind of build connections and build that sense of community to make you feel a little bit less lost, I guess, and find your footing a little bit.
So do you feel like you've done a good job of like building those habits and connections for yourself? And like what sort of things have you been working on as far as like planning for post-MFA?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I still work with Poet Lore, so I'm thankful to have that job that's sustaining me through this degree, but also hopefully afterwards in a part-time capacity. But also there's a lot of different series, reading series on the local level. And in DC, we're very fortunate to have a lot of literary organizations here, places like Split This Rock, Busboys and Poets, the Library of Congress. There's a lot of different sort of paths to take. But I think for me, knowing that I at least have a little bit of a foundation with Poet Lore and the Writers Center, it's given me a little bit of comfort, though I know after graduation, losing the stipend when I graduate will kind of reinvigorate me to get creative again. And local bookstores that do workshops are a really great place to look. But also, I've been talking to my professors about opportunities in pitching long form pieces, creative nonfiction pieces to various outlets and editors that pay their writers. It's kind of no secret that poetry is kind of low on the totem pole when it comes to a payday. So especially need to think about branching out, using the writing skills that I've learned in the MFA, using them in different ways to make a career of some sort.
Well, you've also been editing at the lit journal Folio, which is published there at American. What has that experience been like?
Yeah, it's been so great. It's been a little different now with it being virtual. we typically have a little basement office and we do office hours, and there's a nice community there. But it's nice to be able to work at a literary journal with the backing of a university. There's less concern from the editorial team about things like budget and a lot of those kind of monetary worries. So you can really focus on building a great issue and highlighting the work that you want to highlight. We get so many submissions, so a lot of our work is just going through all of those submissions that we get over the course of the first semester. And then in the spring semester, we really build out the issue because we do one a year. But yeah, it's really great. And it's great to work in different genres too, because my experience at Poet Lore, we do poetry and translation. So I'm really steeped in poetry, but it's nice to get to see fiction submissions, nonfiction submissions. People submit flash and then longer pieces. So it's really nice to see a different kind of scope of the work.
Yeah. Just like you were saying in the program, like getting experience with those other writers in different genres can be cool. And there's things to learn from people in different genres always, I think. So I want to talk a bit about funding at American. I poked around on the website and found that some applicants receive fellowships with full funding. Some receive fellowships with half funding, but there's also something called merit awards that some students get that I'm guessing comes with money, but also apparently those who receive them have the opportunity to work in the writing center as part of the award. I found it all rather confusing.
A little confusing, yeah.
Yeah. So if you could just kind of explain it to us, that'd be great.
Yeah. I don't want to speak for everyone's experience, but it's my general understanding that most applicants who are applying for financial aid and the merit scholarships receive what it kind of shakes out to be about 50% funding. So it's about 50% tuition remission, and then a stipend, which is that kind of work. The merit award is that like 10 hours of work. So if you get that, then you would either be working in the university writing center, doing like writing one-on-ones with other students. Editing folio is another kind of track for that. We also have an online publication called Cafe MFA, which is like a resource for students and alumni with author interviews, blog posts, and things like that. So that's one of the other tracks for the merit funding. What else? I'm missing one. Oh, you can work on our Visiting Writers series, which brings different authors periodically throughout the semesters to, not to campus, but to your screen for readings and kind of chats and things like that. So there's about, I want to say, 4 different kind of paths that you can get funneled into with that merit scholarship. And I think on that page, if I remember correctly, there's like a fine print that says like full fellowships are rarely given, or something like that. And I think that's pretty accurate, from my experience.
So when you get the half fellowship, as you said, it covers half the tuition. And what does that stipend look like for anyone who's considering like whether they can afford to go there?
Yeah, I should have looked this up. I think it's about $4,000 a semester.
After the interview, Emily emailed me to let me know the stipend is actually $4,500 a year, not a semester.
And it's definitely not ideal. And there are places that you can go that are fully funded. But I think, there's also different factors, that play into it. I know for me, I didn't want to move. I'm already in the DC area, and this program provided the flexibility with courses and genres and the faculty that I wanted to work with. But yeah, I mean, DC is expensive. So it does, you do kind of have to really weigh out the options there.
Sure. Well, let's talk about DC a little bit. Most people think of it only in terms of politics, but it's a pretty exciting hub of art and literary activity. So how is living and writing in the capital city?
Yeah, it's great. I think the politics do overshadow a lot of the vibrancy of the art community here. Not just the writing community, but also just the visual arts and the performing arts and things like that. I will give a plug for living in DC is the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities offers individual artist fellowship grants every year. And it's free to apply. And the goal is really to sustain the artists living in DC, to make it an affordable city to keep kind of, keep the arts alive in the city. And I think that that's a really great opportunity to have here, and one that I've been fortunate to benefit from. But there's also, there's so many great reading series. There's one called The Inner Loop that was one where I kind of dipped my toes back into the literary pool, and it's super welcoming and open. Busboys and Poets is a local bookstore restaurant that does open mic nights as well. What else? We have the Library of Congress. So, when the poet laureate gets, inaugurated, you can go to those readings, free events. There's so many things that are going on in the city. More so before, pre-pandemic, but I think pretty much everyone is now adapting to these online event formats and open mics and readings and things like that. There's just almost every night of the week, I would say there's probably something going on.
Well, I spent a week in DC a few years ago, and I did the political stuff and saw a lot of amazing museums and all that. But I think my best memory from that week was going to this bookshop where just by chance once a month they have like readings and free wine and cheese, and we just hung out in this little bookstore and bought a bunch of books and listened to people do readings, and it was fabulous. I loved it. Immediately I was like, I could live in DC, definitely. Well, before we go, I want to give you the last word. If there's any advice you have for people considering the MFA, or any differences that you've seen between like what your expectations were versus the reality of it that you want to share with listeners?
Yeah, I would say, don't rush yourself into a program if you're having hesitations. I think I really benefited from taking some time, even if it was very unproductive creatively, taking some time to really interrogate my motivations for going back to school. But I think, expectations versus reality. I think I did expect to at least feel like I had a lot more time to write. And maybe it would be different if the pandemic wasn't happening and this whole other set of stressful circumstances. But I think that the time management, and knowing your own pace of writing and creating work, for your thesis manuscript, is really important. Kind of know how long it takes for you to write a good poem or a good short story, and be able to kind of pace yourself outside of workshop, because you might not necessarily be turning in work that frequently depending on the workshop capacity and how it's run. So know that you have to keep pushing yourself outside.
Well, Emily, good luck in your final semester as you creep towards the end of your MFA. Hopefully the career panic doesn't hit you too hard over the next 6 months or so.
But, yeah, I hope not.
But thanks so much for being here and talking to me for a bit.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This is great.